the waters of the Suez Canal, joining the Mediterranean and Europe with the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean beyond. The canal has existed since the 1860s, eliminating the long haul around southern Africa and thus saving time, money, and energy. But in the past quarter of a century, it has seen a succession of crises. The best known, exactly 25 years ago, ended in the disgrace and resignation of a British Prime Minister, Sir Anthony Eden.
An international company without consultation and without consent.
Eden reacted strongly to the nationalization of the canal by Egypt, a move which was followed by intense diplomatic activity. Soviet Foreign Minister Shepilov and Ambassador Malek came to London for a special Suez conference. Also attending was one of the United States' most respected diplomats, John Foster Dulles. The Americans did not support their usual Western allies in this Suez crisis, which also brought close collaboration between the often distrustful British and French. The waterway in question divides Africa from Asia, but it runs exclusively through Egyptian territory. It was constructed by a Frenchman and was long administered as a private company, financed with French and British money. Even so, it is still difficult to imagine, in retrospect, why the British and French were so incensed in July 1956 by the nationalization of the canal, a premeditated move by the staunch nationalist and pan-Arabist President Gamal Abdel Nasser. Nationalization of foreign-owned property and enterprises was a common practice as newly independent countries cast off the yoke of colonialism and imperialism. As long as suitable compensation was made, complaints were few. The main reason was deep suspicion in Western countries that Nasser might at some point deny them use of the canal, and so they held a series of consultations to discuss how to meet the new situation. The Americans backed the widely held view that it was a matter for the United Nations. Here, they said, was an existing framework for international cooperation and security. The anti-Nasser brigade was led by Britain's Anthony Eden, who totally rejected the nationalization.
It has been at the service of all nations. True, it runs through Egypt, but it is not vital to Egypt, as it is to many other countries in all parts of the world. Though through it travels today about half the oil without which the industry of this country, of Western Europe, of Scandinavia, and of many other countries too, couldn't keep going. This is a matter of life and death to us all.
This animosity between London and Cairo was reflected in the summer of 1956 by the expulsion of British diplomats from Egypt, a development that did not appear to dismay the Eden government. Eden, who was said to be in a poor way both physically and mentally by this time, appeared to be seeking a total confrontation with a man he regarded as a tyrant, and he in turn expelled the Egyptians from London. The crisis was sharpening, both in the international arena and also on the British domestic front. Early in November, London's Trafalgar Square, traditional place for political rallies in Britain, was filled with demonstrators led by the left-wing Labour opposition. They were protesting against the sudden escalation of the dispute. Open warfare was now threatening, but the Labour Party insisted this was no time for British troops to be sent into Egypt on a military mission. This, they said, would be an act of latter-day imperialism, an act that would be opposed by the United States in particular, and by the wider world in general. Invading Egypt would be a political disaster. Suez was provoking a bigger furor in Britain than any other issue in the post-war years. But Eden and the Conservatives had already started the military machine rolling. Troops in Cyprus were placed on full alert, especially after the news that on October 29th, Israeli forces had launched an attack on Egyptian positions in Sinai. There was no hint that Britain would join the Israelis in fighting the Egyptians. In fact, Britain and France issued an ultimatum against Egypt and Israel that the fighting must stop. The ultimatum called for the stationing of British and French troops along the Suez Canal as a protective measure. But not surprisingly, it was rejected by Egypt, which insisted it had broken no international law. Egypt was convinced that the Israelis, now occupying parts of Sinai and the disputed Gaza Strip jutting into Israel, had been encouraged to attack by the British and French. But the charges of collusion were flatly rejected at the time. Israel claimed it acted solely on its own initiative because of increasing Arab military pressure against it, and in particular in the face of escalating sabotage attacks into Israel by Egyptian commando units, the Fedayeen. Historians have since established beyond doubt, however, that there was collusion between the British, French, and Israelis in the sequence of events. An Anglo-French plan to seize the canal zone with a spearhead of paratroops and commandos had now been given the go-ahead. The period from October 31st to November 4th saw a major air offensive by the British and French against Egyptian airfields and other military targets. This was already in defiance of resolutions put before the United Nations Security Council, but vetoed by the British and French, which besides censuring Israel, also called on all UN members not to get involved in the conflict. The main air and sea attack came on November 5th. The initial landing point was Port Said on the Mediterranean. In spite of fierce resistance, the Allied forces soon controlled Port Said and Port Fuad on the opposite bank. Earlier operations had eliminated the Egyptian Air Force, as well as coastal anti-aircraft batteries and radar installations. French and British aircraft, operating from bases in Cyprus and Malta or from aircraft carriers, reported minimal losses, just one RAF plane which failed to return from its mission. Allied communiques insisted that loss of life in the invasion had been minimal, and claimed every air attack was preceded by photographic reconnaissance with the aim of minimizing civilian casualties. The scenes of damage in Port Said, though, showed that civilian areas did suffer in the bombings. Both sides suffered hundreds of casualties. And now Britain had to try to justify to its own people, and to the world beyond, one of the rare military operations by two Western nations since the Second World War. The pictures of British troops on Egyptian streets were useful propaganda to the many critics of the Suez venture. Prime Minister Eden, an honorable politician in earlier years, was discredited. He resigned a few months later, his career and health ruined. The aftermath of the Suez invasion was a good test for the international organizations. The relief agencies were on hand to look after the interests of the civilian population, while the United Nations was busy trying to restore normality. Thanks in part to American pressure on its European allies, a ceasefire was quickly agreed. The main operation had lasted less than 2 days. Ironically, the French and British had claimed the canal must be kept open at all costs. But Egypt had little difficulty in blocking the waterway, simply by sinking ships. To help stabilize the situation, a United Nations force, including a strong Danish contingent, were sent in, one of the earliest peacekeeping moves by the world body. Their official function was to keep the peace between Israel and its Arab neighbors, a wording which enabled Britain and France to withdraw with honor reasonably intact. They could claim their intervention had similar worthy motives. But in a historical context, the Suez Affair was a diplomatic disaster for the French and British. Their action was seen as a spiteful gesture by two declining colonial powers against a much weaker country that hadn't contravened international law in the first place. Colonel Gamal Abdel Nasser, Egypt's popular president, emerged with his own reputation enhanced. He went on to become an important figure in the Third World, until his death in 1970. The canal was soon reopened, and thanks to Nasser, under complete Egyptian control. It was closed again, though, by the 1967 Arab-Israeli War. This time not only because ships had been scuttled, but also because the Israelis occupied the entire eastern bank in Sinai. This stalemate lasted until October 1973. On the Jewish religious holiday of Yom Kippur, the Egyptian forces unleashed a barrage of fire across the canal at Israeli positions. Egypt and Israel were at war again, this time with the Egyptians seizing the initiative. Canal crossings were planned down to the last detail in 3 separate places. This film is in fact a reconstruction of the canal crossing. The Egyptians spared no expense in restaging the event because it represented one of their greatest military successes. Soviet-built ground-to-air rockets kept the Israeli Air Force at bay and allowed the Egyptians to pour thousands of troops across. The defensive Bar-Lev line was taken, and the Israelis eventually agreed to a ceasefire and a staged withdrawal from Sinai. The Egyptian success helped to pave the way for the late President Sadat's peace initiative. But securing the eastern bank did not mean that the Suez Canal was already operational. 10 ships had again been scuttled to block the canal. Other vessels had been trapped by the outbreak of fighting and lay rusting and in disrepair. Many stretches had been mined by the combatants. The Sadat government, however, lost no time in announcing that the canal would be cleared, widened, and improved as a matter of priority. The great day eventually arrived on June 5, 1975. 8 years to the day after it was closed by war, the Suez Canal was reopened to the world's sea traffic. Egypt had great cause to celebrate. Not only Egyptian national pride was restored, the canal's reopening also meant the return of a valuable source of hard foreign currency in traffic tolls, essential to Sadat's plan to rebuild his country's shattered economy. Like Nasser before him, Sadat died before his work was completed. But whatever the outcome of Sadat's plan for Middle East peace through negotiation with Israel, he will be remembered for his role in the 1973 October War, which led to the restoration of the Suez Canal to its former glory. The canal, for its part, will be remembered mainly for the events of 25 years ago, the Suez Crisis of 1956.